The Story of the Pinecone. Said the north wind. The fir trees heard him coming and bowed their tall heads very gracefully, as if to tell the wind he could not do much with them. Only some of the little ones who had never blown about a great deal felt frightened and said the wind made their teeth chatter. "Do you think we can stay on?" asked one little cone, and the others would have said they didn't know, but the wind gave the tree such another shake that their words were lost. Said the wind, and again the fir trees bowed to let him pass and swayed from side to side, and the great branches creaked and moaned and flung themselves about in a desperate kind of way, but the leaves played sweet music. It was their fashion whenever the wind blew. "I think we shall have snow," said the tallest of the fir trees, looking over the heads of his companions. "The sky is very clear," remarked a very small and inexperienced fir, who was so short he could not see much of anything. "Yes," said the tall one, "so you think, but there is a great deal of sky besides that which is over our heads, and I can see the wind gathering handfuls of snow clouds, which he will fling about us presently." "Yes," repeated the tall fir with another graceful bend. "I see them. They are coming." The evergreens were all sorry to hear this, for nothing depressed them so much as snow. The rain they could generally shake off, at least if it didn't freeze too hard. As for the beeches, they said that if that was the case they must put off their summer clothes directly, and one little beech, with a great effort, did succeed in shaking off half a dozen green leaves the next time the wind came that way. "You need not hurry yourselves," said the tall fir. "This is only an early storm. The winter will not come yet. I can still see the sun for a few minutes every day." And that was true. For a few minutes the sun shewed himself above the horizon, and then, after making a very small arch in the sky, down he went again. Then came the long afternoon of clear twilight, and the longer night, when the stars threw soft shadows like a young moon, and looked down to see their bright eyes in the deep fjord that lay at the foot of the fir trees. For this was on the north side of Norway, and the fir trees grew by one of the many inlets of the sea, which run far away for miles into the country, and are called fjords. At the mouth, the fjord was so narrow, and the overhanging trees so thick, that you might have coasted along backwards and forwards without perceiving the entrance. But to the country people it was well known, and unmistakably marked out by one particular hemlock. Pushing your little boat through its green branches that dipped their finger in the water, the fjord opened before you. The banks on each side were for the most part very steep, and often wooded to the water's edge, while sometimes a pitch of bare rocks and a noisy cataract came rough and tumble down together, pouring disturbance into the smooth waters of the fjord. The fjord itself was too beautiful to be half described. It wound about from rock to rock, now swashing gently at the base of a high mountain, and then turning and spreading out bay-like where the shore was lower and the hills stood aloof, but everywhere overhung or nodded to by the great trees that looked as if they had known it since it was a mere rill. The beeches and oaks and hemlocks, the tall pines like a ship's main mast, and most of all by that glory of those forests, the Norway spruce fir. These watched the fjord everywhere, in the regions of perfect solitude, and in the spots where a little clearing, a waft of blue smoke, the plaintive bleat of a goat mounting up the world, or a hearty bow-wow of some hardy little dog that was minding his own business and everybody else's, told of a human habitation. Back of all, beyond cliff and wood and everything but the blue sky, towered up the peaks of perpetual snow, whose bare heads no man had ever seen. The fjord could not point heavenward after that fashion, but it reflected every bit of blue that came over it, and even when the skies were dark and the snow peaks hid their heads in a cloud, the fjord's reflections were only grave and thoughtful, never gloomy. And the water was so clear. Sailing along in a little boat you could look down for 20 fathoms and see the smooth white sand, with little shells and starfish, and then the bottom of the fjord rose suddenly up like a rocky mountain, over which the boat passed into a deep gulf on the other side. Then came a plain and great forests far down in the water, through which large fishes swam softly about, and then another mountain. In one of the narrowest parts of the fjord, a little spot of cleared and cultivated land lay like a smile between it and the rough mountain. a mere point of land, a little valley wedged in among the heights that rose cliff beyond cliff towards the blue sky, fringed here and there with fir trees. The valley smiled none the less for all this roughness, and the little dwelling that there found a foothold seemed rather to court the protection of the cliffs and to nestle under their shelter. The house was as such best suited to the place. It was built of great pine logs, roughly squared and laid one upon another, with layers of moss between, while every crevice and crack was well stuffed with the same. The roof was of boards, covered with strips of birch bark, and over all a coating of earth 2 or 3 inches deep, in which a fine crop of moss had taken root. The windows were large and well glazed with coarse glass, while very white curtains hung within, and the door was painted in gay colours. Other little huts or houses stood about, forming a sort of square, and furnishing apartments for the pig, the cows, and their winter provision, while one more carefully built than the rest held all manner of stores for the family. Raised upon posts that the rats might not enter, the little alpabod kept safe the fish, the venison, the vegetables, even the cloth, yarn, and sometimes clothing of its humble owners. In sight of the house, a little way down the fjord, was a wild ravine, skirted on one side with a height of thick woods and rocks, while on the other the rocks stood alone, the sharp ridge rising up hundreds of feet to a ledge in some places not a foot wide. On either side the ridge the pitch was very sheer down, the one depth being filled with forest trees which led on to the wooded hill beyond, while the ravine on the other echoed to the voice of a waterfall, that pouring down over a pile of rocks perhaps 200 feet high, foamed into the fjord, which then came eddying past the little hut, bearing the white flakes yet on its blue water. This was all one could see in the valley, but the tall fir trees looked at tall ranges of wooded hills and rocky cliffs, with the fjord in its further windings, and beyond all the snow mountains. "How cold you must be up there," said a little pine who was nearly as high as the tall fir's lower branches. But the fir did not hear him, or perhaps did not take notice, for he was looking off at the fine prospect. "Yes, it is cold up here," answered one of the fir cones, "and windy, and there's a great deal of sameness about it. It's just snow and rain and wind and sunshine, and then snow again." "That's what it is everywhere," said the wind as he swept by. "I can't help it," said the cone. "I am tired of it. I want to travel and see the world and be of some use to society. What can one do in the top of a fir tree?" "Why, what can a pine cone do anywhere?" said some of the beech mast. "The end of a pine cone's existence is not to be eaten up, however," retorted the cone sharply. "Neither am I a pine cone, though people will call me so. We firs hold our heads pretty high, I can tell you. But I will throw myself into the fjord some day and go to sea. I have no doubt I could sail as well as a boat. It would be a fine thing to discover new islands and take possession." "It would be very lonely," said a squirrel who was gathering beech mast. "Royally so," said the pine cone. "There one would be the king of all the trees." "The trees never had but one king, and that was a bramble," said a reed at the water's edge who was well versed in history. "What nonsense you are all talking," said the tall fir tree at length. "My top leaf is at this moment loaded with a snowflake. There is something sensible for you to think of." At this moment the hut door opened, and a woman came out. She wore a dark stuff petticoat made very short, with warm stockings and thick shoes. A yellow close-fitting bodice was girdled round her waist, and from under it came out a white kerchief and very full white sleeves. On her head she wore a high white cap. She looked first at the weather, and then turning towards the fall she watched or listened for a few minutes. But water and rocks and firs were all that the eye or ear could find out. Then going up to a line stretched between 2 of the fir trees, she felt of some things that hung there to dry. "I suppose that was her clothes line," said Carl. "No, it wasn't," replied the cone. "I might rather call it her bread line. The things that hung there were great pieces of the inner bark of the pine tree, and looked very much like sheets of foolscap paper." "She didn't make bread out of them, I guess," said Carl. "Yes, she did," replied the cone. "She made many a loaf of bark bread by pounding the dry bark and mixing it with flour. It wasn't particularly bad bread either. So people say. I never tasted it. But the country folks in Norway use it a great deal in hard seasons, and in those woods you often meet pine trees that have been stripped of their bark, and that have been dried and bleached in the weather till they look as if made of bone or marble. Well, the pieces of bark were dry, and Norska began to take them off the line, for of course the snow would not improve them. Who was Norska? Interrupted Karl. The good woman that came out of the house. She took them down, and when they were all in a heap at the foot of the tree, she began to carry them off to the Alpabod. That is the little storehouse I spoke of. Then she went back into the hut for a minute, and when she came out again, she had on a long-sleeved grey woolen jacket and her lure in her hand. What's that? Said Karl. The lure is a long trumpet-shaped thing made of hollow pieces of wood or pieces of birch bark, tied together and 4 or 5 feet long. What was it for? Said Karl. Why, you shall hear if you have patience, said the cone. Norska raised the lure with one hand, and putting her mouth to the little end, there came forth of the other sundry sweet and loud sounds, which echoed back and forth among the rocks till they died away, far up the mountain. But I say, said Karl, what for? And he took hold of the pine cone and gave it a little pinch, but it was pretty sharp, and he let go again. The pine cone settled himself down on the chest, looking just as stiff as ever, and then went on with his story. Norska sounded her lure twice or thrice, and presently the head and horns of a red cow shewed themselves high among the rocks. Then came in sight her shoulders and forefeet, and her hind feet and tail, and the whole cow began to descend into the valley, while a dun cow's head shewed itself in just the same place and fashion. But when Norska had once seen that they were coming, she ceased to watch them, and turned to the fall again. Its white foam looked whiter than ever in the gathering dusk. The grey clouds which were fast closing in overhead sent down a cold grey light, and the water before it broke no longer sparkled with the sun's gay beams, but looked leaden and cold and deep. Then, breasted with snow like the stormy petrel, it came flying down the precipice to plunge into the deep fjord below. Its very voice seemed changed, for the wind had died away, and the steady roar of the water was the only sound that broke the hush. There was no living creature in sight, unless a little lemming peeped out of his hole, or an eagle soared across the sky, a mere speck upon its clouds. The cows had reached the valley, and now stood quietly chewing the cud, having had the precaution to turn their backs to the wind. And now Norska fetched the milk pails, and drove the red cow up to the milking corner, and as she went a snowflake fell on her forehead, and another fell on top of her head, and the fir trees sighed, and bowed their heads to what they couldn't help. Norska sighed too. The winter is coming, she said, and the snow, and truly the Alpabod is but poorly filled. And Sneeflocken sick, and laughed not home from Lofoden, and Klein, what can keep him? And again she looked towards the fall. Klein was there now, she could see him plain enough, though he was but a little spot on that sharp ridge by the waterfall. The path itself was hard to find, as it wound over and under and around the points of rock that met on the ledge. A stranger could scarce have climbed it but on hands and knees, yet down there came Klein, sure-footed as a chamois, swiftly down and singing praises of the rocks and streams and woods and snow as he came. But before he reached the foot of the hill, Klein's song stopped. With the first look at the hut, his thoughts had outrun his feet, and with a quieter step now he came down into the valley and up to where his mother sat milking the red cow. In one hand was a gun, in the other a string of golden plovers. "How late, Klein?" said Norska. "Yes, mother. I tried to get a shot at a reindeer." "How is she?" Norska silently pointed to a snowflake which, falling on her hand as she talked, had lain for a moment in all its pure beauty, but was now melting fast away. She watched till it disappeared, and then bending her head lower than ever, she resumed her work. Klein stood silent and thoughtful. "Maybe not, mother," he said at length. "Her appetite has been better lately. See, I have these plovers for her tonight, and tomorrow I will have the deer. Think of my finding one in these parts." But his mother said no more, and when the pails were full, Klein took them from her and carried them into one of the little huts, and then returning, he drove the cows into their little log dwelling, and taking up his birds and gun, he walked slowly to the house. But the gaily painted door was out of tune with his mood, and he turned and went round the back way. Leaving both gun and birds in the kitchen, Klein opened softly a door leading to one of the bedrooms and went in. The corners of this room and the sides of the windows were boarded, and the floor was strewed with fresh twigs of the juniper tree, which gave a sweet smell through the room and made it look pretty too. Of the 3 windows, 2 looked towards the fjord and 1 to the mountain and over the little clearing. The bed stood in a recess that had doors like one of your cupboards, but these were now open, and by the bedside stood a little white pine table, and upon it a wooden bowl and spoon, all prettily carved. "How were they carved?" said Carl. The bowl had carved upon it a spray of the wild bramble, twining round with its leaves and berries, and the handle of the spoon was like a wild duck's head, and the feet of the table were like bear's feet. Klein had done it all, for in Norway the men and boys carve a great deal and very beautifully. And this bowl and spoon had been made for his little sister as he sat by her bedside. And Klein was very proud of them. The feathers on the duck's head were beautifully done, and the brambleberries looked pretty enough to eat, but Klein did not once look at them now, for something far prettier lay on the bed, and that was little Sneeflocken. "What did they call her that for?" said Carl. "Because that is the name of the snowflakes, and she was just as pure and fresh as they, and had never had the least bit of colour in her cheeks from the time she was a baby. You could scarcely have distinguished them from the pillow, but for the fair hair that came between. She was covered with a quilt made of down, for Klein had risked his life almost in climbing to the high difficult places where the eider ducks build their nests, that he might get the soft down which the mother duck plucks from her own breast to keep her eggs and nestlings warm. And Norska had made it into a quilt, the warmest thing that could be, while the weight of it was almost nothing. And beneath this soft quilt Sneeflocken lay with her eyes closed and singing softly to herself in the Norse language a hymn. Klein had to step back into the shadow of the door of the recess to wipe the tears off his face before he could venture to speak to his little sister, but she spoke first. "Klein?" "What, dear?" said her brother, coming forward. "I thought I heard your step," said Sneeflocken with a smile, and putting up her lips to kiss him. "Where have you been all day?" "Oh, over the mountains, hunting," said Klein as cheerfully as he could. "I saw a great big reindeer, Flocken, and I mean to go and find him tomorrow. That would fill the alpabod nicely, and you would like some venison, wouldn't you, dear?" "Oh yes," said Flocken with a little smile, "but I wouldn't kill the deer for that." "I would," said Klein, "and it would help Mother too." "I should like to help Mother if I could," said Sneeflocken, putting her little thin hands together. "But Jesus will. I have asked him." "Why, you help us all," said Klein, "just as the birds do when they sing or the sun when it shines." "Maybe I shall by and by," said the child, smiling again in that grave, quiet way. "Yes, by and by, when you grow up to be a strong woman," said Klein. "No, Klein," said Sneeflocken, stroking his face. "No, dear Klein, but by and by when I go to heaven. Maybe God will let me help take care of her then, and of you too, Klein. But you will not know that it is your little Sneeflocken." And Klein could only sit and hold her in his arms and say nothing. The snow fell all that night, and the winter set in early, and the waterfall scattered icicles upon every branch and rock in its way, and then built for itself an ice trough through which it poured down as noisily as ever. Then the sun never showed his face but for a few minutes, and the rest of the day was twilight. And at night the moon shone splendidly, and the northern lights showed peaks of fire in the heavens, or sometimes there were only the stars burning clear in the high lift, and twinkling down in the dark fjord between the shadows of the fir trees. Now and then a bear would come out and prowl about the little dwelling, or a wolf gave a concert with the waterfall. But cows and pigs were safe shut up, and Foss the little dog showed so much disapprobation at the concert that often the wolves did not have one for nights together. Laft, the father of Klein, got home from Lofoden with his stock of dried fish, and Klein himself had shot his reindeer, and both meat and fish were safely stowed in the alpabod. Didn't the wolves know that? And didn't their mouths water sometimes at night till they were fringed with icicles? But they never tried to break in, for the alpabod was strong, and little Foss knew as well as the wolves what good things were there, and scolded terribly if everybody and everything did not keep a respectful distance. And besides all that, the wolves were afraid of the light that always shone from one room of the little cottage. "This is a very quiet way of life, ours," said the fir trees, nodding to each other. "I'm very tired of it," said one of the cones. "It's very cold up here, and really in the dark one cannot see to do much." "A fir glories in the frost and the cold and the snow," said the tall tree proudly. "We are not called upon to do anything, to keep it from blowing too fiercely upon the little hut, and to show our fine heads against the sky. The snowbirds are warm in our arms during the long night, for we have plenty of good clothes all the year round." The beeches heard this speech, but were too frost-bound to make any answer. What became of the discontented pine-cone, said Karl. Did he throw himself into the fjord? Yes, said the cone. At least one night he tried to, but he fell on the shore instead, just dropped down at the foot of the fir tree, and there Klein found him one day, and picked him up and carried him into the house to show Flocken. He was such a large one. Every night through the winter was that light burning in the same room of the hut, and every day did Klein come out with his gun and spend what daylight there was in hunting. Sometimes he brought home a hare or a ptarmigan, or a partridge that he had snared, or a wild duck, while his father was cutting wood, or away in his boat to catch fish. I could get only one partridge today, dear Flocken, Klein would say upon his return home, but maybe I shall find something better tomorrow. Oh, Klein, said his little sister, how good you are to take so much trouble for me, but it's a pity to kill the birds. They can't make me live, so we might let them. Wasn't that a good one you had yesterday, said Klein. Oh yes, said Flocken, it was delicious. I think everything is good that you get for me and that Mother cooks, but then you know I can't eat much. If you had seen her as she lay there, so thin, so white, you might as soon have suspected a very snowflake of eating much. So it don't make much difference, repeated little Sneeflocken, what I have. Only I do believe, Klein, that I like to have you take so much trouble and go away up in the snow to get things for me. And she put her arms round his neck, and laying her white face against his coarse grey jacket, she stroked and caressed him, till Klein thought his heart would burst beneath the weight of that little snowflake. When the spring comes, he said, we will go up the mountains and look for flowers, and I will make you a wreath of violets and fringed pinks, little Flocken. Sneeflocken stroked his face and smiled, and then she looked grave again. And forget-me-nots, Klein, she said softly, you will want them too. The little blue forget-me-nots. They are so like the sky colour. You will think about me, Klein, whenever you see them, for I shall know what the sky is made of then. Where's Mother? She is cooking your partridge, said Klein. Don't you smell it? Oh yes, said the child, smiling, and I guess the wolves smell it too. How loud they howl. You are not afraid of them, said her brother tenderly. No, said Sneeflocken with a strange look of weakness and trust upon her little face. No, I am not afraid of them, for the Good Shepherd is very strong. I should be if it wasn't for that. How kind he is, Klein, to think about such poor children as we are, and it's kind of him to take me away too, for I'm not very strong. I don't think I could ever be of much use. You are of too much use, my little Sneeflocken, said Klein sadly, because we shouldn't know what to do without you. Why, you will have me then, said the child, looking up in his face, just as you have the flowers now, Klein, and you can think about me, and say that some day you will go up and up to find me. Up to find you, said Laft, who with Norska had just entered the room. Are you going to play hide-and-seek with Klein upon the mountains, my little dear? But Norska asked no such questions, for she knew what Sneeflocken meant well enough. But she brought the roast partridge to the bedside on a little wooden platter that had a row of pine cones carved all round the edge, and sitting down on the bed, she watched the child eat her scanty supper when Klein had lifted her up and wrapped an old cloak about her. Little Voss had followed them in, and now he sat wagging his tail and beating the floor with it, just because he felt uncomfortable and didn't know what to do with himself, not at all because he smelt the partridge, for he knew perfectly well that Sneeflocken was sick, and when she had finished her supper and called, "Voss, Voss," the little dog ran to the bed, and standing as high as he could on his hind legs, thrust his cold nose into her hand, and whined and whimpered with joy and sorrow. Then in a tumult of excitement, he dashed out of the house to bark at the wolves again. They watched her so by day and night through the long winter, but before the first spring days came, the little snowflake had melted away and sunk down into the brown earth. They made her grave within the little clearing, just between the house windows and the mountain, where the fir tree shadows could just touch it sometimes, but where the sunlight came as well. And within the little white railing that enclosed the grave, they placed an upright slab of wood, upon which Klein had carved these words as Norska desired him. "Say unto her, Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child?" And she answered, "It is well." The grass grew green and fresh there, and the little blue forget-me-nots that Klein had planted about the grave soon covered it with their flowers. And sometimes, when Klein stood there leaning over the paling, he almost fancied that it was as she said, that God had sent her to take care of them, and that it was not the soft spring wind which stroked his face, but the hand of his little Sneeflocken. He thanked God that she was safe in the arms of the Good Shepherd, and for the hope that when his time came to go, he should find her in heaven. "Were you that discontented pine-cone?" said Carl, when he had sat for some time thinking over the story. "Yes," said the cone, "and I was carried into the house as I told you. And then, because Sneeflocken had once held me in her little hand, Klein said he would keep me always." "But I say," said Carl, knitting his brows and looking very eager, "how did you get here?" "Because other people were as foolish as I was and didn't know when they were well off," said the cone. "For Klein was your mother's grandfather, and when he died and she left her home to follow the fortunes of John Krinken, she brought the old pine cone along to remember the tall fir trees that waved above the old hut in Norway, and to remind her of little Voss and Klein and Sneeflocken."